This week on the IoT Podcast.
So if you look today, this is all sensor based basically. You have these sensors that are extension of the sensors of the driver. So whether it's camera for vision or radar or LiDAR technologies or ultrasonic technologies, all of these are playing together to kind of extend the eyes and ears of the driver, if you like. So one of the areas that we'll focus very much on is camera systems. So if you look today, whether it's the lane keeping assist, the automatic emergency braking, or even when you're parking your car and you now start to see these surround view technologies, they're all areas that we're developing chips for in the vision space. Similarly in radar, radar's been used for probably 20 plus years now in cars for kind of automatic emergency braking, but now you get adaptive cruise control that uses radar. But actually also inside the cabin, you're starting to see some radar systems being deployed. That's an area we're working in as well. We want the technologies, but we don't want the aesthetics of the inside of the car or the outside of the car to be spoiled. So how do you miniaturize it? How do you bring the power envelope down so you can still have the technology without having these ugly bumps, within the vehicle or outside the vehicle? At first blush, you think, well, lighting, how complicated can that be? But actually, in the car, you want an even light pipes. You don't want the color to be kind of going light and fade and the luminance, the chrominance being different. So actually having the thermal management that allows you to do that is actually quite tricky. And as a company, Indie is focused on where we think we can have the maximum impact, which is more on the ADAS. You mentioned level 1, level 2, 2+. I think there's still a lot that we can do positive for society by bringing that technology, ubiquitously to all of the vehicles today.
Yes.
I think autonomous will happen, but we think there's good work we can do while that's being figured out.
Welcome back to the IoT Podcast. I'm your host, Tom White. Every week, we are joined by the biggest names in IoT to unravel the trends, misconceptions, and predictions for the Internet of Things. Before we get into today's episode, don't forget to subscribe on whichever platform you're watching or listening on, and turn on that notification bell so you're never out of the loop.
In this special two-part episode featuring Indie Semiconductor, we're kicking off with none other than Chet Babla, SVP of Strategic Marketing. We'll be delving into the latest megatrends shaping IoT in the automotive sector, a topic I really love, covering driver safety, automation, in-cabin user experience, electrification, and autonomous vehicles, plus much more.
Chet, welcome to the IoT Podcast.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
Well, it's nice for you to be here in person. I can count on one hand how many times we've done this in person, and it's always pleasurable to see people face to face.
Yeah, thought I'd jump on the opportunity since I was in the country.
Yeah, well, thank you for coming. So, Chet, if you could start by giving a little bit of intro to yourself and Indie as a business for our viewers and listeners that may not know you or indeed the company.
Okay, so Chet Babla, I started over 30 years ago in the technology industry in semiconductors. Started as a chip designer, so RF analog. Just down the road here in Swindon, actually, working at GC Plessey Semiconductors. So worked in design roles for a few years and then kind of went into the dark side of the business. So product management, product marketing, business development. And that's taken me over the years into various roles in the tech industry. And currently I'm with Indie Semiconductor. So Indie is a pure play automotive semiconductor company, and we're developing chips targeting the automotive market, and looking at kind of the key 3 automotive megatrends that we see today, which is electrification, driver safety and automation, and also in-cabin user experience.
Amazing. Thank you. Yeah, I think the automotive industry for me is constantly evolving, and the rapid pace that we're seeing at the moment with certain Chinese manufacturers and a real kind of change of guard, really, I suppose, in who's dominating the automotive industry is really quite fascinating. In terms of those 3 main mega trends, so we've got that here. I think you're absolutely right. The electrification is something that takes a lot of press at the moment in the wider world, but actually in cabin user experience and what we used to call, ICE, right? And driver safety automation are the two main areas. Touching on the driver safety automation to start with then, Chet. So previously, we've spoken on the podcast about ADAS systems and so on. In your own words, and again, for our viewers and listeners who may not understand ADAS, what is ADAS and why should we take note?
Yeah, so ADAS basically is short for Advanced Driver Assistance Systems. So these are technologies that are really developed to assist the driver in any element regarding safety of driving the vehicle. So it's intervention that can happen as well. So if you haven't seen a car braking in front of you, then the automatic emergency braking system will cut in. It will recognize that there's a threat and it will apply the brakes. Similarly, you have lane keep assistance system. So if you're driving on the highway and you're starting to veer off, you're not paying attention, the cameras in the vehicle will start to notice you're starting to go over the white lines and bring you back into position, or warn you through vibration in the steering wheel. And also most recently, you're starting to see driver monitoring systems coming into the cabin as well. So making sure the driver's paying attention, and if you're tired, if you're distracted, if you're not looking at the road ahead, these systems will start to warn you to pay attention. So I think these are multiple technologies that are starting to come into play, really to help the driver as an extension of the driver, not necessarily to take over from the driver. So we're seeing this is starting to become a big trend now in automotive. There's a lot of regulation around this. There are a lot of new car acceptance programs that are trying to encourage car makers to add these technologies. Over 1.2 million people die on our roads globally every year. So anything you can do from a technology perspective that can help drive that number down quickly has got to be something the industry welcomes.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's a staggering number. I didn't realize that 1.2 million globally. Yeah, I mean, that's colossal, isn't it? I think the main thing for me is that as a user and also a technologist within the industry is actually these systems working in harmony with the everyday driving.
Yeah.
So what they're not trying to do is to take over. They're meant to be a system to aid and to help the experience of driving. And I think most people now have an ADAS system in their car. They have the lane change assist or so on, and it's incredibly useful. And in fact, if you go back sort of 10 years, it would be quite odd actually to not have this now. It's many years ago we didn't, right? And India's involvement within there. So India are actually producing chips that work in driver safety. Is that right?
That's right, yeah. So if you look today, this is all sensor based. Basically, you have these sensors that are extension of the sensors of the driver. So whether it's camera for vision, or radar, or LiDAR technologies, or ultrasonic technologies, all of these are playing together to kind of extend the eyes and ears of the driver, if you like. So, one of the areas that we're focused very much on is camera systems. So if you look today, whether it's the lane keeping assist, the automatic emergency braking, or even when you're parking your car and you now start to see these surround view technologies, they're all areas that we're developing chips for in the vision space. Similarly in radar, radar's been used for probably 20 plus years now in cars for kind of automatic emergency braking, but now you get adaptive cruise control that uses radar. But actually also inside the cabin, you're starting to see some radar systems being deployed. That's an area we're working in as well. So if you look at very high frequency radar, like 120 gigahertz, the resolution of that is such that if you have, say, a baby in the back seat with a blanket over the baby, the radar has the granularity to even detect the breathing, the respiration of the baby. So if you have a left child in the car, for those kind of applications, you can start using radar, and that's an area that we're working on. Some of the challenges around these areas is all around integration. We want the technologies, but we don't want the aesthetics of the inside of the car or the outside of the car to be spoiled. So how do you miniaturize it? How do you bring the power envelope down so you can still have the technology without having these ugly bumps, within the vehicle or outside the vehicle?
Yeah.
And then lastly, LiDAR, it's more of a new technology. So we're starting to see LiDAR developed for very long range detection. So each of these technologies have their pros and cons. LiDAR is very good for long range, very fine resolution sensing. So we're developing a technology called coherent LiDAR detection. 20 plus years ago when radar was deployed in vehicles, it used a pulse-based detection. So you send a ping out and you wait for it to come back, and you can use that to range the object in front of you. Very quickly, people realized that was very susceptible to interference from other radars, for example. So people moved to this coherent detection. So for LiDAR, we've learned from what happened in radar, and we've gone straight to coherent detection as well. So we're seeing this starting to get deployed now, and we've leapfrogged the technology and gone straight to coherent detection for LiDAR as well.
Yeah, I think LiDAR's had a lot of press in recent years, and it's been emerging as a very useful technology, albeit to start quite cost prohibitive, I think, for quite a lot of manufacturers. Do you see the cost of that coming down as it starts to be more mainstream in the future and more applications in real world uses?
Yeah, I think that's a good observation. I think, as with any new technology, when it's first being deployed, trying to bring that cost down without sacrificing the performance is a big challenge. And today, if you look at the cost of LiDAR, it's still quite prohibitive, and you only really find it in luxury vehicles or as a expensive option. One of the things we're doing is working with optical companies who can really integrate down the optics side of LiDAR, and then we have our signal processing technology that we pair with that to help. We really need to bring the cost down to $200 per car for it really to be adopted, mainstream. And again, all of these technologies are about bringing safety to the mass market. If it's just the preserve of luxury vehicles, we're not going to benefit from the ability to bring these accidents down to reduce that fatality rate. So our focus very much is, how do you bring this to mass market adoption? How do you bring the costs down? $1,000 is not the right price point. You need to get down to 200 and lower. No,
indeed. I can imagine. I mean, that statistic that you mentioned about 1.2 million, I would imagine there's an incredibly small slice of that being in the luxury market, right? So, of course, the aim is, and Indy's aim, one would imagine, would be to bring the cost of this down to make it more inclusive, right, to a lot more vehicles out there. Yeah. That's fantastic. And in terms of the other mega trends that we spoke about, so in-cabin user experience. Yeah. So, again, many years ago, that would just be the radio. Yeah. But now it's this whole term of user experience. And we've seen it really shift from, CarPlay becoming very well adopted and used, a lot in the automotive industry. But it means a lot more than that, doesn't it? In your own words, Chet, what is in-car user experience?
Yeah, I think traditionally it was the infotainment system was the in-car user experience. And if you look today, it's so many other elements that are contributing to that kind of safe, enjoyable, engaging journey for drivers and passengers. So, things like lighting is really overlooked. But if you look today in today's cars, the number of lighting modules they have, you see the light piping across the dashboard, in the doors, in the roof. Audi, for example, has publicly stated lighting is part of their brand differentiation. They're putting a lot of effort into the lighting. So, at first blush, you think, well, lighting, how complicated can that be? But actually, in the car, you want an even light pipes. You don't want the color to be kind of going light and fade, and the luminance, the chrominance being different. So actually having the thermal management that allows you to do that is actually quite tricky. So lighting is one area. The other area is just the electrification of everything that used to be a mechanical function. So seats we're all very familiar with. You get massage seats now. You get electronic vents for the air conditioning, obviously the sunroof. So there's lots of electrification of previously mechanical functions. We're all getting lazy and we want motors to do the work for us. So that's another area. You mentioned CarPlay. So CarPlay, Android Auto. We all want that seamless experience we've got used to on our mobile phones, on our tablet devices. We expect that in the car as well. So you're seeing more screens, touch control of those screens, even seeing voice control now coming into the car. So these are all elements that are helping to bring that really engaging user experience to make our journeys a bit more, interesting and engaging, especially when we're stuck in traffic jams more and more, it seems these days. So they're all areas around in-cabin user experience beyond just the infotainment system.
Yes. I can imagine. I think, there's probably two forces at play here, isn't there? The in-car user experience and pushing more time and emphasis on the lighting, because of course, at the moment, predominantly in the world, we drive our cars. We have assistance features, but in terms of the scale of level 1 to level 5, most people are at 1 and 2, right? And there actually is limited amounts that you can do with the in-car experience, because of course the driver is still driving. But on the flip side is that we are designing and testing autonomous driving cars, right? So at a time in the future that may well change to more of an audio-visual effect, including the driver as well as the passengers. I have a question around CarPlay and Android Auto. It seems to me from a user point of view at the moment that when people step into vehicles, being able to use the infotainment system, cognitively, because it's an extension of their phone, is such a prerequisite now. Do you see a time in the future where actually manufacturers will put less emphasis on the development of their own infotainment systems, menu systems, etc.? Because actually that's hard for people to adopt and learn easily enough. Is that a trend you see happening?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's an interesting point, because a lot of OEMs, car makers, have tried to develop their own human-machine interface systems, and by and large they've struggled. And part of it is because the heritage of the car makers, they haven't really been technology first, software savvy entities. So they've tried and they end up making these clunky kind of user interfaces. So on the flip side, we've had CarPlay, Android Auto come along, which basically take away a lot of that development complexity for car makers. So I think they're trying to find the balance between having something the consumer is very familiar with, comfortable with, but also making sure some of the data and information is not also given away to these big tech companies as well. So it's a tricky balance. I think that software development challenge is an ongoing one. I'm not sure that car makers have found the right balance yet in terms of how much they just give to the tech companies and say, okay, you can do it better than us, versus we need to have some direct contact with our consumer to understand what they like, what they prefer, so we can build that into the in-cabin user experience.
Yeah. I think that's a really pointy thing that you just mentioned there. The car is now, or ever increasingly more software defined than it was of yesteryear. And what we've seen through podcast episodes in the past and through experience is actually some parts of the automotive industry are similar to the manufacturing industries. And when you look at industrial Internet of Things, it can be quite slow to move and to gain pace and traction. And that's presumably why some manufacturers have struggled actually to have their infotainment systems or their options as cohesive as say some of the large manufacturers of mobile phones. So that's a really interesting point. In terms of that phrase, human-machine interaction, HMI design, where does that extend to within the car? So is that outside of infotainment? Is that everything from, touching buttons to various other aspects of the car? Could you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, absolutely. In any way that you want to interact with a vehicle, or you want access to data or information, so that's a HMI kind of activity that's happening. And screens are all familiar with. I think if you look at some car makers, they've maybe gone to one extreme and everything is done through the screen. And people say, well, I just want to turn the radio up, I want to turn the volume up. Why can't I just have a simple button for that? So we are seeing OEMs are realizing and learning from this, and they are putting in some basic set of control in terms of switches and buttons. There's also interesting trends around like smart surfaces as well. So, where you have your dashboard, you can, rather than having a physical button, You can have sensitive materials that you're using. So you still have the aesthetics of the in-cabin, but you can have the control through touching. So I think that's an area we'll start to see a lot more innovation happening as well, this kind of smart materials for interactivity as well.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that would be great to see that. I've not seen that or witnessed that. Actually.
Yeah. There's a few OEMs are working in that space.
Okay, yeah. I do concur with that. Can I just not have a button? That,
Yeah.
I do. But I think actually, whilst it's, humorous to say that, I think from a safety point of view, I can understand from a design aesthetics and perhaps cost consideration to have a touch screen. If we look at Teslas, for instance, everything is done on the main screen, but when you're driving along, you just want to be able to turn something off intuitively. And that can be hard, with a touchscreen interface. And of course, there's, developments in haptics and developments in various touchscreen technologies at the moment to enable that. But I think there's a hybrid, isn't there? There's a balance between what you can do and really what you should be doing and what people want. Would you say so?
Yeah. I think ultimately the consumer will dictate where these kind of in-cabin user experiences go. So if the OEM has gone too far one way or the other, it will eventually play out in terms of car sales.
Yes.
So I think they will find the happy balance that we as consumers are looking for.
Yeah, absolutely. And then, so moving on to electrification. So, again, a massive topic at the moment. It never seems to be out of the press, and for good and for bad. We are transitioning into EV. So certainly sat here in the UK, we have a date. We don't know if that is the date. It may move, but no comments on that. But we have a time frame that we're moving towards. So, from an indie point of view, this is a colossal challenge, isn't it, in terms of supply chain, manufacturing, design, release of chips in order to enable this to happen at scale. So I wondered if you could talk a little bit about that, Chet.
Yeah, so I think the whole electrification movement is here to stay.
Yeah.
There's too many social imperatives for us to ignore it. I think there's been a lot of negative press around electrification recently. The cars are a little bit more expensive. The charging infrastructure hasn't quite caught up. With the cost of living crisis and cost of energy as well, EVs don't seem as appealing as they used to. But I think the report of the demise of electrification is somewhat premature, right? So, we got used to like 50% year-on-year growth of EV, production. Now it's about 25-30%. That's still good in anyone's book. So I think we've gone through that early adopter phase, and now we're coming out into that kind of mass adoption.
Yes.
And now we're seeing every mainstream OEM has got multiple EVs in their portfolio. So I think, again, it's finding that right kind of price point for the mass market consumer. And I think we're getting there. But there's still, the challenges around cost are there. Around deploying that charging infrastructure. Even in California where I live, when I drive past these charging places, there's huge queues, right? So we still need California is one of the fastest adopters of EVs, so the rest of the world has got a long way to go. But again, the greenhouse gas climate change imperative is so strong that we do need these alternative powertrain options if we're going to hit some of the goals that we're setting ourselves as a society for climate change.
I was going to mention that to you. I wondered what it was like in practical senses in California, because I have friends that live in California, and many are in Teslas, and there are other brands available, but they seem to live with it quite adequately. But I wonder how much they're charging at home as opposed to on the road. And yet you're coming to Europe, and I was on holiday recently in Cyprus, and you cannot see a single EV anywhere, right? So there really is a large disparity at the moment, isn't there, from a geography perspective about the uptake of EVs, but also the infrastructure, and it doesn't seem to be in balance.
Yeah. And it's varying around the world, right? So charging, if you're living in a city or town where there's a predominance of apartments rather than houses, then getting access to charging at home can be a problem.
Yes.
if you look at Norway, I think every new car sold now is an electric car. So different countries are at different stages of that evolution. There's different regulatory, incentives that are being played out. So I think we'll get there. I think the key thing is to have choice for the consumer, and then governments need to do their bit to enable the infrastructure that's needed to have this electrification choice as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think certainly from in the UK, there's been various tax initiatives and incentives to be able to do that. And that stat in Norway, I've heard that before. I mean, that is quite spectacular, really. But also, I think testament to the culture of Norway and people's wants and wishes within that. One of the main things that we see here is battery management, range. So from an IoT perspective, often it's being played, EVs, roughly 200 miles per charge, and then of course you go to the charging station and it's queued. You've got your neighbour in his petrol car, and he's able to fill up in 2 minutes and drive off, right? So where are we with increasing range or increasing battery capacity? And are we going to get to a world where we see the 1,000-mile range that's been spoken about in the press in the past?
Yeah, that's the $64,000 question, right? So,
well, if you could answer it, that'd be great.
Yeah. Well, again, it comes back to what is the use case? Like, there's a lot of people who just drive 5-10 miles to work every day.
Yeah.
So a smaller battery is sufficient for them. But if you're going on longer journeys, 200 plus, then that whole range anxiety, will I get access to a charger? Will it be working? All comes into play. But we are starting to see now OEMs are starting to go beyond the 300 mile type of capability in terms of battery. Battery technology is evolving. People are looking at new battery technologies, solid state batteries. So I think that innovation is going to keep continuing. Again, the imperative for society is there. And whilst there's an imperative and money to be made, people will invest in innovation around that area. And, if you look at some of the technology going into cars in an understanding state of health, state of charge of the battery, you start to see these algorithms are running on the car to understand, okay, here's the type of driving, here's the road surface, here's the weather conditions. Okay, I can pinpoint where I am, where's the nearest charging point. People start to use cloud-based algorithms to, try and maximize, the charging capability. So I think there's still a lot of innovation that's happening, and that's going to keep nudging that range ahead and address some of these anxieties that people do have about EVs.
The technology for me is advancing quite quickly, but there's other parts of the world. You look at Guyana, for instance, who are now, drilling for the first time into their huge reserves, whereas previously they weren't. So you have a kind of geopolitical kind of fallout from this, which is quite unfortunate, because I think the technology is there and getting better at a rapid rate. And some of the work that Indy is doing is tremendous, actually, in advancing this. As a society, we all need to come together to understand why we're doing this and why it's a benefit. But I think we're always going to face that problem, aren't we? With some resistance to this moving forward.
Yeah.
So it's an interesting time. And specifically to getting into a bit more the detail around Indy's role within electrification. So could you talk a little bit about some of the developments in India doing there and what this means for the wider world?
Yeah. So if you look at some of the key things around electrification, a big area is kind of like the battery management systems, battery sensor hub capability, some of the power management around those batteries, needs like supervising capabilities to understand how are the controls around the battery charging being deployed correctly. So we're working on areas around that. Of the three auto megatrends, electrification is probably the one that we've got the biggest opportunity to accelerate in, because it's the one that we've kind of come to a little bit later. So if you look at the core competencies that Indy has, it's all around mixed signal design, analog, digital, bringing those together. And you need that in abundance when it comes to electrification. So I think we've got a lot of opportunity there around the battery management systems, power management systems. So we're working on some areas already, but I think there's a lot of opportunity for us, because if you look, a lot of the systems that control the batteries today, they're quite fragmented. If you look at the cell monitor, if you look at the microcontroller, if you look at the functional safety block, if you look at the system basis, they're all separate chips. And really, that's what keeps the costs high, right?
Yeah.
So our kind of claim to fame is to look at a system and say, why isn't this integrated? Let's integrate it. So that's the kind of opportunities that we're looking at.
It's amazing, yeah. I mean, some of the things that I've seen in the past, which are being particularly interesting for me from an IoT and sensors perspective, and I'm not quite sure how this would work in the EV world, but concepts like energy harvesting as well. So one of the most common concepts of energy harvesting is the humble TV remote control, right? Where actually it doesn't necessarily need a battery anymore, and through kinetic forces and so on, it's able to charge itself. But I think certainly with battery management, there's so many different objects at play, and simple physics dictates that every kind of energy or every action has an equal and opposite reaction, right? So you would imagine there's a lot here through things like regenerative braking and other aspects in order to keep that kind of energy stored in the most useful form. And so it's interesting to see that Indy's looking at this from lots of different angles at the moment.
Yeah, absolutely. I think this all comes back to how do you maximize the range for the driver, for the passengers, and looking at all of these different capabilities like regeneration are really important. But also remember, we're putting all of this electronics into the car. If all the electronics is doing is sucking the battery, you're not going to be able to go as far. So the other side to look at it is, yes, we want these electronic capabilities in the vehicle. How do you minimize the power consumption of that electronics to make sure that juice is there to propel the vehicle, not just power the electronics as well? So again, big area that semiconductors has an opportunity to play in terms of reducing that power consumption, integration, to help maximize that battery capability.
Yeah. I remember many years ago in you can remember the old Nissan Skyline, but it used to run on 3 cylinders until the car was warmed up. And in fact, when it was cruising, it used to run on 3 cylinders. And that obviously had tremendous results in the efficiency of the fuel usage. But it's similar, I would say, with electric vehicles, such as driving at night, for instance, lowering the lighting systems, as we said. The audio, do you need that audio at that point? And this kind of intelligent use of management of the of battery and power consumption is really pivotal. It's simply scaling up the reduced battery capacity button you have on your phone, right? You can see a time in the future where we might push a button on the dashboard and all the lights dim somewhat or so on. And do you think we're getting to that point where you'll be able to do that in the future within cars?
I'm not sure actually, because if you look at the safety functions, you don't want to compromise those.
Indeed,
right?
Yeah.
So are there other elements of the vehicle, maybe some of the in-cabin user experience, potentially you could dial that down to conserve the battery? I think it still comes back to designing highly efficient electronics in the first place. So, needing complicated cooling, thermal management is probably not the right start point for EVs. So making sure you're designing these electronic control units, ECUs, that are power efficient from the get-go, maximizing the capability of semiconductor integration to keep that power consumption as low as possible, so you're not having to make these kind of trade-offs when you're driving down the road and say, I've only got 10% battery left, what can I start turning off in the vehicle?
Yes.
I think that you probably don't want to have to make those compromises.
Indeed. Yeah, indeed. Yeah, absolutely. I think that's pivotal, isn't it? That the safety systems are there, but there's lots of things that we could do with heat, for instance, as well. Regenerative use of heat that comes out. There's specific companies now in the world looking at how to reuse heat from data centers, for instance, right? So that would be fantastic to see. In terms of the kind of the big subject of autonomous vehicles and the impact of both the electrification driver safety, automation, etc., in autonomous vehicles. What is your view and Indy's view on the potential of this with transportation as a whole?
So I think the potential is huge. The reality is it's going to take longer than people are thinking, and you've seen that recently with some of the things that have been, covered in the news around some of the autonomous drive companies. I think again, much like safety, the imperative is there. Taking cars off the road, having reusable transportation is important. For some of those who are unable in society to get around for whatever reason, elderly folk, I think the potential of autonomous is huge. But there's still a lot of work to do around regulation, around some of the tech. A lot of these cars use machine learning, which are essentially complicated pattern recognition systems. So whenever you throw at something it hasn't been trained for, it doesn't know how to cope with it. So how do you respond to those scenarios? And that's what we're seeing with some of these, autonomous companies. They're struggling when they're presented with a new scenario they haven't been trained for.
Yes.
It's kind of like, does not compute. What should I do? Oh, stop. And you're getting these, towns being clogged up with AVs that are getting confused. So I think the potential is there. The reality is the mix of regulation and kind of the machine learning has still got a little bit of a way to go. So, as a company, Indy is focused on where we think we can have the maximum impact, which is more on the ADAS. You mentioned level 1, level 2, 2+. I think there's still a lot that we can do positive for society by bringing that technology, ubiquitously to all of the vehicles today.
Yes.
I think autonomous will happen, but we think there's good work we can do while that's being figured out.
Yeah. I mean, it's great to hear that. And I think from a level 1, level 2, 2+, as you mentioned, I think there are refinements that still need to happen. And it's widely spoken about in the press. It's some of the cars coming out of, say Germany, for instance, at the moment, they have some tweaks that are needed within the systems, right? So, and we really got to nail that and get that 100% correct in order to have the reassurance and safety within the consumer to be able to advance to the next level. And I could tell you myself, I wish my car, would stop juddering me into the next lane, even though I'm not in the next lane, right? So, but it's a few years old now. So actually, if it's a few years old, then, the development of that chip, that sensor perhaps was 5-6 years previous to that, right? So because of the scale of pace of innovation, I think it's really important that we do refine those levels correctly. And it's nice to know that Indy shares the same view that there is still a lot of work to be done in getting this really, really excelling before we move up the stack.
Yeah. I mean, these are difficult problems we're trying to solve, right?
Yes,
so as humans, we take for granted using our senses to understand the world around us. If you start looking at cars with radars and cameras and LiDARs and ultrasonic, one is to take that data, but then to process it and make sense of it is quite difficult. One example that we've seen is, some of the camera systems in cars today, they struggle between identifying red and amber colors. So, if you are starting to go into higher levels of automation and you're a traffic light, you really don't want to mistake red and amber. So that's an area we're actually putting a lot of effort into. If you look at our image signal processing, we're putting a lot of effort to be able to make sure that definition, that luminance, chrominance information can properly be differentiated, so the algorithms in the car can make the right decision that should I be stopping or should I be getting ready to go?
Yes.
Again, these are hard problems, which is why having multiple modalities of sensing is important, because you get the best of all of those sensors, but also you build a level of redundancy as well.
Yeah.
So, again, it's tough problems. 1, the sensing. 2, making sense of it, using the right perception and maximizing how you use that data that you're generating from all of these sensors.
Yeah, I mean, no one said it was easy, right? And but I think that's proven. It does make me laugh. Of all the colours, you wouldn't want to get confused. You wouldn't want it to be red and amber. Chet, thank you so much for coming on to the podcast today. It's been absolutely great having you here. As always, we have some questions for guests at the end of the show, and this is the question that we have for you today. What challenge do you face, Chet, in your everyday life that actually you'd really love a technology solution for that problem that isn't currently there?
Actually, this is nothing to do with automotive. Whenever I message my daughter, she never sees the message. So can someone please design something on a phone that prioritizes her father's message? So whenever she unlocks the phone, the first thing she sees is a message from me, because she's always like 2 days later, oh, I never saw that. So,
okay. Yeah. Hopefully she's not just saying that as well. I think that would be a great suggestion. It's funny you should say that, because I had a thought about a year or so ago, actually, with Outlook on my computer. Actually, there's some really important messages, and actually, rather than it just having an exclamation mark, why doesn't it flash red as a beacon on your computer if it is that important, right? Because that's the way that would stop you doing what you're doing to look at, right? So yeah, I completely agree with you on that. A couple of quick fire questions as well, Chet. So what's a gadget that you can't live without?
A boring but smartphone. Right?
Okay, the standard one, I get it.
Sorry.
A book, movie, or song that sparks your inspiration.
Book, Touching the Void by Joe Simpson. A tale of human survival. Two climbers, they have an accident up in the mountains, and the guy is left for dead, and he manages to crawl back to safety, and it's just a very inspiring story.
Oh, wow. Okay, crikey. Yeah, it sounds it. And lastly, as we're filming this on the first week of April, but what is a tech trend or a fad that you'd like to see come to an end this year?
I'm not sure about come to an end, but you mentioned data centers earlier, actually. Something I picked up on last week is that data centers already account for 2% of global energy usage. And they're projected in the next couple of years, data center energy consumption is going to be the equivalent of between a whole Sweden or a whole Germany. So I think continuing innovation to make sure we're mindful of that energy consumption, I think that would be interesting. And I think things like large language models and that kind of AI, yes, while it's important, we need to be thoughtful about the larger impact of what these technologies are having.
Yeah, goodness me, that's a lot, isn't
it?
Yeah. It picks up on our point earlier about the cylindrical effect of the data center, either using the heat or something that you can at least try and obtain for the energy that's being used to power it. But that really is quite staggering.
I mean, some of the tech companies are trying to power the data centers only through renewables, but I think being more mindful about that will be important as our expectation of AI goes up over the next few years.
Yeah, absolutely. But I thought we'd get to the whole podcast without mentioning AI, but we've just done it. Only kidding. Chet, it's been lovely having you on the podcast. Thank you for coming in today.
Thanks for having me.